Tonight on Reporting Scotland, a lawyer admits he knowingly allowed false information about Edinburgh's tram contract to be submitted to the council. Also on the programme, the number of Scots undergoing compulsory treatment for mental health problems is on the rise. A Shetland man is jailed for a campaign of abuse against his wife over a 30-year period in almost cult-like circumstances. The First Minister's had her light bulb moment. How do you start your own energy company? And the state of Scottish football. Do we have any reasons to be cheerful? Hello there, good evening. The Edinburgh Trams inquiry has heard the project lawyer admit that he allowed false information about the contract to be submitted to the council. And during questioning, he accepted that the legal implications of that amounted to fraud. Maura Kinneborough reports.
How can future public projects avoid the mistakes of Edinburgh's trams? Bitter disputes over contracts cost the project huge amounts of time and money. The inquiry picked over the detail. The tram project lawyer was asked again and again if he knew information about part of the contract was false, yet let it go to council. He disagreed with the wording, was unwilling to go that far until pressed further.
I would hesitate to go as strong as that, agreeing with you. I agree that the information in those closed reports was deficient.
Well, it's more than deficient, isn't it? It wasn't accurate.
Yes, my lord, was not accurate.
It wasn't true.
Correct.
So it's false.
Yes.
And the consequences?
You know the legal significance of knowingly providing false information to someone, don't you?
I do.
Because it amounts to fraud, doesn't it?
It potentially is a criminal offence, yes. And a civil one as well.
And you were aware of that in May 2008. You were aware that's what was happening.
Later, Mr Fitchie said when the documents were read as a whole, he did not think they were deliberately misleading.
Mr Fitchie said at least two senior people from the tram company Thai would have known the information being given to Edinburgh Council was inaccurate. He said they were present at virtually every discussion about this aspect of the tram contract, and he would find it incredible if they hadn't known or understood this.
The trams were delivered 3 years late and hundreds of millions of pounds over budget. The inquiry continues. Maura Kinneborough, Reporting Scotland, Edinburgh.
The number of people undergoing compulsory treatment for mental health problems is on the rise. The Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland says the number of new cases is the largest it's been in 15 years. There are concerns so-called legal highs could in part explain the rise in mental health crises. Here's our health and social care correspondent Shelley Joffrey.
When a mental health crisis hits, it can be a dark and desperate time. A doctor has the power to hold someone for assessment for 3 days with an emergency detention certificate. The Mental Welfare Commission is concerned about the rapid rise in their use.
We've seen a significant rise over the last year, 12%, and over the last 10 years, a 26% rise, which is significant. And we see significant variation in their use between different health boards. They should only be used where other routes to detention which afford more safeguards to the patient are unavailable or unpracticable because there'd be too much delay.
Emergency detention certificates were used more than 2,400 times last year, but only 54% had the consent of a specialist mental health social worker, something that should be routine.
Now, of course, the rise in these emergency detention orders could simply be because more people are actually getting the treatment that they need in times of crisis. The trouble is that no one really knows.
From my experience, there are new challenges that have come before mental health services in recent years. One of them is the challenge of novel psychoactive substances. We used to refer to them as legal highs. I was involved in continuing the detention of somebody this morning who probably has taken a legal high and was really disturbed. If it hadn't been for his swift detention in hospital, he would have probably died. And that's something that wouldn't have occurred a few years ago before legal highs were available.
More research is needed, they say, to work out why a growing number are being detained in this way and whether these orders are being used correctly. Shelley Joffrey reporting, Scotland, Edinburgh.
A controlling husband who subjected his wife to almost 30 years of domestic abuse has been jailed. A Stirling man accused of public indecency in Dubai has been sentenced to a month in prison for drinking alcohol in the country and making a rude gesture. Now, the Prime Minister has told MPs the UK will leave the Common Fisheries policy when it leaves the EU in 2019. But questions have been raised about what would happen in any transition period after Brexit. Theresa May told MPs the controversial fishing agreement will cease, but any arrangements during a transition period will have to be negotiated. Over now to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley. Nick.
Katrina, the Common Fisheries policy is highly controversial. Scotland's fishermen, quite frankly, despise it. They think it's had a massively detrimental impact on their industry. We also know that the Prime Minister has pledged the UK will leave the EU at the end of March 2019. And today she was asked what that would mean for the Common Fisheries policy.
Is it the Prime Minister's intention that the United Kingdom should remain part of the Common Fisheries policy during any transitional period after we have left the European Union?
When we leave the European Union, we will be leaving the Common Fisheries policy as part of the agreement that we need to enter into for the implementation period. Obviously, this and other issues will be part of that agreement. But when we leave the European Union, we will leave the Common Fisheries policy.
Now, that's been welcomed by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, but they say any implementation phase must be short, months rather than years. For example, they say a 2-year transition, as many in Whitehall are mentioning on the overall idea, would be far too long. And the Scottish Government is questioning whether the EU will allow the UK to remain in a transition phase but leave the Common Fisheries policy. My understanding is that in Whitehall, the issue of what transition on fisheries would look like remains unresolved. But there are some in government who hope that by the time quotas for 2020 are negotiated, it will be the UK rather than the EU making those deals.
Thanks, Nick. A community energy project say they could potentially work with the Scottish Government to develop a new publicly owned power company. The First Minister has announced plans to buy cheap energy to help people on low incomes. Edinburgh-based Our Power already receives public funding and say it makes sense to work together. Here's our political correspondent, Andrew Kerr.
Already on a tight budget, Karen White, a Glasgow mum, got a terrible shock to find she was in debt to her energy supplier when her fixed deal ended.
When the winter months come in, you are putting it on every morning and you're going to keep it on all day. Because some days my son's in the house all day because of his disability. I can't have him sitting here freezing. He's got to have heat. You know, so that's a massive concern, absolutely.
To help those on low incomes, the First Minister said in her conference speech yesterday that a publicly owned not-for-profit energy company will be set up by mid-2021. Almost a third of homes in Scotland are said to be in fuel poverty, spending more than a tenth of their income on fuel.
Good afternoon, you're through Our Power. Ryan speaking, how can I help you?
A not-for-profit company is the model. That's the idea behind Our Power, set up by Scottish housing associations and community groups. Could this set-up be the spark for the government's own company?
There's potential for Our Power and the Scottish Government to work together to try and develop something at maybe a larger scale or something that allows the Scottish Government to meet its objectives. I think if we're both trying to provide fairer energy at a lower cost, we're both trying to tackle fuel poverty, then it would make sense to work together.
Taxpayers could be in line for a cheaper deal from a government supplier.
Not having the profit for shareholders clearly makes them more competitive than would otherwise be the case. At the same time, it remains to be seen how well they buy energy, at what price they buy energy, and how efficiently they deliver that service to customers with the cost base involved there, remembering that there are start-up costs too in getting up and running.
The First Minister opened Scottish Power's new HQ in the summer. It's one of the big 6 energy companies who say they welcome new additions to the market, pointing out it benefits competition and keeps prices down. This comes as the UK government plans to cap fuel bills.
So a government-owned energy company is not worrying the big suppliers.
The First Minister's idea has certainly fired up the debate about the role of the state in the corporate world. Andrew Kerr, reporting Scotland, Glasgow.
A world-leading climate expert says the Scottish Government should keep momentum by legislating for a carbon-neutral economy by 2050. Manuel Pulgar-Vidal believes Scotland's leadership could be instrumental in maintaining global climate ambitions at a time when the US President Donald Trump is frustrating them. Our environment correspondent Kevin Keane reports.
He was the Peruvian environment minister whose work paved the way for the Paris Agreement, limiting global temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius. And now he wants Scotland to lead the way by promising to make our economy carbon neutral by the middle of the century. An important move, he tells me, in keeping the climate high on the worldwide political agenda.
I think that is going to be enough when Scotland can adopt a clear target of zero emission by 2050, a carbon neutral economy by 2050. I hope...
Is that achievable?
It is achievable, but it is interesting because there are many people who are skeptic that that is achievable. And you know why? Because people is used to think in relation to the current context, but we should think in an evolving context.
He thinks technology in renewables and other areas is changing so rapidly that progress might come more easily than currently envisaged. Tackling global emissions starts at home, and a low emissions zone in Glasgow confirmed yesterday is one way of addressing that. But he says the Scottish Government has to look beyond its own borders to achieve real progress.
Scotland could play a really important role in trying to keep momentum and trying to keep this consensus, even in the most difficult scenario, to continue evolving this negotiation into the real and clear implementation of the Paris Agreement.
The Paris Agreement is adopted.
Paris was a landmark moment, but this year's conference in Germany will look to develop that global commitment, and hoping the US won't try to frustrate the process. Kevin Keane, reporting Scotland.
A Celtic fan who invaded the pitch and assaulted a player has been ordered to carry out 160 hours of unpaid work. The former Scotland manager Craig Brown says the national side's unbeaten run this year should mean Gordon Strachan keeps his job. Now, his comedy creations include radio host Alan Partridge and political spin doctor Malcolm Tucker. But now a reminder of tonight's main news. The Prime Minister and her Chancellor appeared to be at odds today in planning for the possibility of the UK leaving the EU without a deal. Philip Hammond told MPs that taxpayers' money will not be set aside until the last moment. But an hour later, Theresa May said the government is committing money to prepare for every Brexit eventuality, including no deal. And the Edinburgh Trams inquiry has heard the project lawyer admit that he allowed false information about the contract to be submitted to the council. During questioning by the inquiry chairman, he accepted that the legal implications of that amounted to fraud. And that's all from us on Reporting Scotland for the moment.